Welcome. Today we're going to be examining a collection of source material provided to us that details one of the most profound and, frankly, heartbreaking miscarriages of justice in modern British history.
It's a story that really requires a great deal of respect, not just for the incredible injustice suffered by Peter Sullivan, but also for the original victim, Diane Sindel.
That's absolutely central to this. Our mission here is to methodically walk through these sources, to chart the legal and scientific timeline that ultimately stole nearly 4 decades of a man's life.
And what the facts reveal is a kind of systemic fragility, really, at almost every single level of the justice process.
The man at the core of this story is Peter Sullivan. He was convicted of murder back in 1987. He went on to serve 38 years. Let's think about that number for a moment. 38 years.
It's almost impossible to comprehend.
It is. He was finally exonerated in May of 2025. He was 68 years old. And what's astonishing is that he's the longest-serving known victim of a miscarriage of justice in Britain.
The sheer scale of time is just immense. 38 years. I mean, that period covers the invention of the World Wide Web, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the entire rise of the digital age.
He went into prison when forensic science was, well, rudimentary in many ways.
And he came out when DNA analysis was seen as definitive proof. But before we get into the mechanics of how he was falsely convicted, I think we have to understand the environment, the fear that existed when this investigation first began.
Okay, let's start there. Let's unpack that. We're in Merseyside, 1986. The sources paint a terrifying picture of the crime that set this all in motion.
Yes, the first part of our material really details the circumstances around the murder of Diane Sindel. She was just 21 years old, living in Seacombe, working as a barmaid at the Wellington Hotel.
And she was working to save money for her wedding, building a future.
Exactly, a future that was, just so tragically stolen from her.
The night of her murder. It's the early hours of August 2nd, 1986. And it's all set in motion by a simple, terrible piece of bad luck.
That's right. The sources confirmed she ran out of fuel while she was driving home in Birkenhead. She was forced to walk the rest of the way.
So she's navigating the streets near Borough Road sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. A very vulnerable situation.
Extremely. And it was during this walk that she was attacked. Her body was discovered a short time later in an alleyway just off Borough Road.
And the reports, the physical evidence, they paint a grim, almost unbelievable picture of extreme violence. It really explains the scale of the public reaction that followed.
The pathologist's report, which is cited in our material, it details a devastating level of brutality. Diane Sindel had a fractured skull, massive injuries. Injuries consistent with being beaten repeatedly with some kind of blunt object across her head and face.
But it wasn't just the blunt force trauma.
No. On top of that, she was raped and had been repeatedly stabbed in the chest and genitals. There was also evidence of mutilation of the breasts and lacerations. It was an attack that was characterized by just extreme, almost frenzied violence.
There's a quote in the sources from the pathologist that just brings it all home. He noted that these injuries were the very worst he had ever seen on a human body.
Outside of a road traffic accident.
Yes, for a personal attack, that is a horrific assessment.
And the timeline suggests that her suffering was not instantaneous. Witnesses in the area reported hearing screaming, a loud argument, sometime between midnight and 2 in the morning.
Right.
And the medical assessment suggested that Diane remained alive for some period of time after the initial attack. The final cause of death was determined to be a brain hemorrhage, which resulted from all those blows to her head.
So what was the immediate public impact of this? This wasn't treated as just another crime, was it? It seems to have shaken the entire community of Merseyside.
Oh, absolutely. It generated revulsion, fear, widespread anger. The forces note that many women in the area were genuinely afraid to be out on the streets alone.
So the police would have been under enormous pressure.
Enormous. Pressure to provide safety, to reassure the public, and to capture the person responsible as quickly as possible. And this led to an investigation that was, for its time, historically large.
How large?
It was the biggest investigation in the entire history of Merseyside police up to that point.
So you have this atmosphere of intense fear, and it's meeting this intense institutional pressure to get a result. That feels like a fertile ground for mistakes, doesn't it?
It is, especially when the public and the press start creating these horrifying labels for an unknown person.
Right, the monikers.
Yes. The sources confirm the perpetrator was given several chilling names. The Mersey Ripper, the Beast of Birkenhead, and the Wolfman.
And these names reflect the public's desperation, right? The sheer savagery of the attack.
They needed a monster to be caught, and the police needed to deliver one. And that pressure, that rush to find someone, is a critical backdrop for understanding how the focus is zeroed in so quickly on Peter Sullivan.
And maybe how willing some investigators were to, let's say, overlook certain procedural protections.
Exactly. It really sets the stage for what happened next.
So let's transition to that. Part 2 of the material. The arrest, the interrogation, and the fatal flaws that built a case that would take, well, 38 years to finally dismantle.
So we move from the crime scene to the investigation itself. Peter Sullivan, who was an unemployed laborer living in Birkenhead, was arrested on September 23, 1986. That's nearly 2 months after the murder.
And the initial reason for his arrest was strikingly weak.
It was. We're talking about circumstantial evidence. The primary reason was that he had provided conflicting accounts of his exact whereabouts on the 1st and 2nd of August.
He was probably confused or scared or both.
And his own personal vulnerabilities become a central tragedy here. The sources mention a later assessment from a psychologist who characterized Sullivan as being suggestible and possessing limited intellectual capacity.
That profile is just profoundly important, isn't it? Because a person who is suggestible, who is intellectually vulnerable, is uniquely susceptible to the kind of manipulative techniques that can be used in a high-pressure interrogation.
And according to Sullivan's own sworn accounts later on, which are documented in the material, these interrogations weren't just high pressure. They involved severe alleged misconduct that violated the core principles of justice.
What were the allegations?
They're deeply disturbing. They suggest a very targeted effort to break him. Sullivan alleged that while he was in custody, he was physically beaten.
And beyond that, he claimed he was systematically denied some fundamental human needs.
Yes, food, sleep, and, crucially, access to a lawyer when he asked for one.
To deny a suspect those things, especially a vulnerable one, is to strip them of the physical and mental resilience they need to maintain their own truth under pressure.
And then there was the psychological pressure. The material states he was explicitly threatened. He was told he would be charged with rape if he did not confess to the murder.
So it's a false choice.
It's completely coercive. It's presenting him with an option. Confess to this murder now, or you're going to face this other equally damaging rape charge. For a suggestible person under that kind of intense physical and mental duress, any semblance of free will is just gone.
And this all leads us to the confession, the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. And the sequence of events around that supposed concession is, well, it's highly suspect.
It is the moment where this case was fatally corrupted. The first alleged confession happens on September 24th. Sullivan reportedly broke down in tears and offered the confession.
But he immediately withdrew it.
He did. He withdrew it shortly after giving it.
And what is absolutely staggering here, and it just raises this enormous red flag about police procedure, is that this pivotal moment, this supposed breakthrough where he confesses, was not recorded?
No. While many other interviews conducted by Merseyside police were recorded, this initial crucial confession was left entirely off the record.
That's just, it's unbelievable. The lack of documentation for the very moment a suspect supposedly admits guilt, it creates this unassailable legal loophole, doesn't it?
It does, because if it's not recorded, the defense can't directly challenge the specific words the police used or the emotional state of the suspect at that critical point. It insulates the entire process from any genuine scrutiny about coercion for decades to come.
And he did repeat the confession later, but that pattern of immediate retraction is so telling.
Yes, he withdrew that subsequent confession as soon as he finally got access to a solicitor on September 25th. The moment he had independent counsel, the confession just vanished.
And we really have to emphasize the major procedural failure here that went beyond just denying him a solicitor.
We do. The law at the time, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, specifically required that police provide an appropriate adult for any suspect they knew or even suspected had learning disabilities or significant mental vulnerabilities.
And the sources are clear on this point.
They are. Police were aware of Sullivan's limited capacity, yet they completely failed to provide this legally mandated safeguard.
That single failure, the denial of an appropriate adult, should be enough on its own to render any confession unreliable, let alone one that was allegedly obtained under conditions of physical abuse and sleep deprivation. It shows a deliberate bypassing of the established safeguards for vulnerable people.
And this systemic failure to protect the suspect leads directly to what is probably the most damning piece of information about the confession, the anecdote about the map.
Yes, The coaching detail. Can you walk us through how that sequence played out according to the source material?
So during the recorded parts of the confession process, the officers needed Sullivan to demonstrate what they called knowledge only the killer would possess. This is a standard technique to validate a confession.
So they asked him to use a map.
Yes, a map of Birkenhead. They asked him to point to where Diane Sindall's clothes were hidden. When Sullivan pointed to the wrong area on the map, the officer allegedly guided him, telling him the exact location he should be pointing to.
That is explosive. It completely transforms the confession from an admission of guilt backed by specific knowledge into a recitation of facts that were supplied by the investigators themselves.
It confirms retrospectively that the police were not just seeking the truth, they were constructing a narrative.
And a narrative that fit the man they had in custody.
Exactly. This means that the physical details of the crime, the very details that were supposed to validate his confession, were actually invalid from the start. The entire foundation of the prosecution's case was built on the coercion and the coaching of a highly vulnerable person.
And this fatally flawed confession, despite being retracted, was what was presented to the jury as the primary evidence of his guilt.
It was.
So now we move to the 1987 trial. The jury has to assess this flawed narrative. This is part 3, the case that was actually presented to the jury. What were the 2 main pillars they used to secure the conviction? And, how strong were they really?
The prosecution's case at the 1987 trial rested very heavily on 2 pillars. We've gone through the first one in detail, the coerced and retracted confessions. The second pillar was the supposed physical link.
A link that seemed definitive at the time.
Yes, but would later prove to be highly questionable pseudoscience.
And that second pillar was the evidence from forensic odontology, bite mark analysis.
That's right. The material confirms that bite marks found on Diane Sindall's body were matched to the dental impressions taken from Peter Sullivan.
And at the time, in the 80s, bite mark analysis was seen as a pretty solid form of forensic evidence, wasn't it?
Regrettably, yes. It was considered viable, even strong evidence, especially in high-profile violent crime cases like this one. Odontologists would argue that the unique geometry of a person's teeth provided a kind of signature that could be matched to injuries on skin.
But the underlying science has since been, comprehensively discredited. What is it that makes bite mark evidence so unreliable?
It fundamentally lacks a rigorous scientific basis, unlike, say, DNA or fingerprints. Human skin is an incredibly elastic, curved, and dynamic surface. The act of biting itself isn't static. The skin stretches, it moves, it distorts the impression.
So it's not like a perfect mold.
Not at all. And what's more, the definition of what constitutes a match is entirely subjective. It relies on the visual interpretation of one forensic odontologist. There's simply no universal standard, no quantifiable error rate for matching bite marks to one specific person.
So the prosecution was able to present this pairing, a coached confession, which provided the story, and this subjective forensic matching as the physical proof. It seems like an ironclad case was presented to the jury.
It was. And the prosecution also provided a simple motive to tie it all together. Their theory was that Sullivan had attacked Diane Sindall in a drunken rage after he lost a game of darts earlier that day.
So that gave the jury a comprehensible, if circumstantial, reason to explain the violence that was suggested by the confession he'd given. It just tied the whole false narrative together very neatly.
It did.
And here is where the element of just tragic delay becomes so apparent. While they were relying on this subjective bite mark analysis, the real, objective, definitive scientific evidence was literally present, stored away in an evidence locker.
Yes. The sources are very clear on this. Semen samples were collected from Diane Sindall's body at the crime scene. This was the one piece of evidence that could have definitively established who the perpetrator was.
Or, just as importantly, definitively excluded Peter Sullivan.
Absolutely. But the tragedy is that the technology to run that definitive analysis wasn't available to Merseyside police in 1987.
It's just terrible timing.
It is. DNA fingerprinting had been discovered by Alec Jeffreys in 1984, but the complex, expensive, resource-intensive technology was not yet a standard implementable tool for routine forensic work by regional police forces in the UK.
So they did the right thing by collecting and storing the samples.
Yes, that was good investigative procedure for the time, but those samples remained biologically silent for decades.
So the trial goes ahead with what we now know was this concoction of human error, procedural violation, and pseudoscience, all while the actual truth was lying dormant in a freezer, just waiting for science to catch up.
It creates a compelling but ultimately false case. The coerced narrative provides the motive, the bite marks provide the physical link, and the lack of DNA technology ensured that the only voice that could speak the real truth, the biological evidence, was completely silenced.
The confluence of those specific failures made this miscarriage of justice. Well, it seems almost inevitable.
It does.
So what was the jury's final decision based on this flawed foundation?
Despite Peter Sullivan pleading not guilty, despite him maintaining his innocence throughout the entire proceedings, he was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 16 years.
And crucially, the sources emphasize that even after he was sentenced and throughout his 38 years in prison, he never once wavered in maintaining his innocence. He fought the system from the inside for nearly 4 decades.
That's right, he never gave up.
If we connect this to the broader legal context, the combination of a coerced confession and evidence that is now, universally rejected by the scientific community, it just demonstrates a systemic vulnerability, doesn't it? The justice system at that moment valued a good story over objective fact.
And that failure meant that Peter Sullivan had to begin the next chapter of this story, the decades-long struggle for his exoneration. And it wasn't a quick process once DNA technology matured. It was an agonizing administrative delay.
Let's talk about that initial resistance he faced, because the bureaucratic inertia here seems almost as cruel as the initial conviction itself.
It was devastating for him. His defense team first sought a review from the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the CCRC. That's the body that investigates potential miscarriages of justice in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
So they submitted their application, presumably hoping that the advent of DNA analysis would provide quick relief.
That was the hope. But the CCRC rejected the application in 2008. By this point, he had already served 21 years.
And what was their reason for rejecting it?
The CCRC said there was little chance that new DNA evidence could be successfully recovered from the stored samples after such a long period. They believed the biological material would be too degraded for any meaningful analysis.
That must have been just soul-crushing. To know the evidence exists, but to be told the system won't even look for it because it might be too difficult or too degraded. It's an administrative blockade rooted in pessimism.
And the stagnation just continued for another decade. Even as late as 2019, Sullivan's application to the Court of Appeal was also rejected.
So the legal system was just entrenched in that original 1987 verdict.
It was highly resistant to reopening the case, even as global forensic science was advancing exponentially. The burden of proof you need to overturn a conviction, even with compelling non-DNA evidence of procedural abuse, is just incredibly high.
But then the turning point finally came. In 2021, something shifted. Something forced the CCRC to completely reverse its position.
The shift was entirely technological. It was a triumph for evolving forensic science. The CCRC officially reversed its 2008 decision, acknowledging that new advances in forensic investigation had made retesting those aged crime scene samples not just possible, but imperative.
What kind of advances are we talking about here? How did 21st century science overcome the obstacles of 35 years of potential degradation?
We're talking about highly sophisticated techniques, things like low copy number DNA testing, which can analyze incredibly minute or degraded samples. These techniques are able to amplify the tiniest traces of genetic material, allowing scientists to generate a full profile from what was previously considered completely unusable biological evidence.
So the CCRC's recognition of this new science is really what highlights the importance of continuously applying new standards to historical cases.
It's critical. Without that willingness to reevaluate based on new technology, he might still be in prison.
So the evidence that had been silent since 1986, those semen samples, was finally ready to speak. And what did the results of the 2021 retests reveal about Peter Sullivan?
The results were absolutely definitive. The analysis showed, unequivocally, 2 things. First, Peter Sullivan's DNA was not present in the semen samples recovered from Deanne Sindall's body. He was completely biologically excluded as the source.
And the second thing?
The second thing was that the genetic markers that were present belonged entirely to a complete unknown male DNA profile, the profile of the actual killer.
That is irrefutable, scientific proof of innocence delivered 35 years after the fact. The man who was convicted based on a forced confession and unreliable bite marks was physically exonerated by the definitive power of DNA.
And this scientific certainty led directly to the final legal conclusion in May of 2025. The Court of Appeal, with Lord Justice Holroyd presiding, formally quashed Sullivan's conviction.
On what grounds?
They ruled the conviction was unsafe, which led to his immediate release from prison. He was 68 years old and had served 38 years.
That moment must have been just overwhelming. 38 years of fighting, of maintaining his innocence, and then finally the judicial system formally acknowledges the profound injustice.
The sources confirm the immense emotional weight of that moment. They note that Sullivan cried as the judges quashed his conviction. But while that release grants him his freedom, it really only marks the beginning of the next part of his life, the legal and personal recovery process.
Which brings us to part 5. Life after 38 years and the unfinished justice.
Yes.
And the first, most immediate consequence is the search for the true perpetrator. The discovery of that unknown DNA profile has completely reignited the original murder investigation, hasn't it?
It has. The exoneration of Peter Sullivan simultaneously means that the murder of Diane Sindall is officially an unsolved case once again.
And Merseyside police have confirmed that the new DNA profile doesn't match anyone they had on file.
That's right. It doesn't match Diane Sindall's family or her fiancé. The true killer, the man the press dubbed the Mersey Ripper, has evaded capture for 38 years and is still free.
So the police now have this incredibly powerful new tool, a definitive genetic profile to apply to historical suspects. What is their investigative strategy going forward?
Well, the sources indicate that Merseyside police are beginning the very extensive process of requesting new DNA samples from other individuals who were investigated during the original 1986 inquiry.
So it's a cold case review, but armed with 21st century technology.
Exactly. They have to systematically cross-reference this definitive DNA profile against every historical suspect, every person of interest, hoping for a match that will finally bring some justice to Diane Sindall's family.
It's such a profound twist of fate. A scientific breakthrough frees one victim of the system, but at the same time, it reopens the wound for the family of the original victim, confirming decades of frustration and false closure.
It really speaks to the devastating long-term consequences of a flawed initial investigation. If the procedures had been ethical back in 1986, or if DNA technology had been immediately available, both of these tragedies might have been avoided.
Now let's turn to the justice, or maybe the lack of it, for Peter Sullivan himself. He's a 68-year-old man, released into a world that has fundamentally changed, and he's facing what the sources call the compensation paradox.
Yes, and this is where the legal system imposes one final, cruel hurdle.
Can you explain this paradox? It's one of the most intellectually difficult parts of the justice system to comprehend.
Well, Peter Sullivan's conviction was quashed because the Court of Appeal ruled that the original evidence was unsafe. That means the legal process that convicted him was demonstrably flawed and could no longer be trusted.
But the sources highlight that under current UK legislation, just being released because a verdict is unsafe is not enough to automatically grant you compensation. He has to meet a much higher, almost impossible standard.
He has to provide new evidence that proves he is factually innocent beyond a reasonable doubt. This is the core of the paradox. The system is demanding that he provide definitive proof of a negative, that he was nowhere near the crime scene, or that he was definitively excluded in every single possible way just to receive redress for the decades it stole from them.
But wait, why is the DNA evidence not enough to prove factual innocence? It definitively excludes him as the source of the semen found at the scene. How is that not proof beyond a reasonable doubt?
And that is the critical, and some would say cruel, legal nuance. The DNA evidence absolutely excludes him from being the source of the semen. This means he was not the rapist. However, a cynical legal interpretation might argue that, theoretically, this doesn't definitively prove he wasn't physically present at the scene in some other capacity.
That seems like an impossible standard.
The bar is set so astronomically high that it forces exonerees into these complex, protracted, and expensive legal battles. The government essentially created this high bar to limit compensation payouts.
So, after losing 38 years of freedom, of his employment history, family life, social connections, he may still have to fight for years just to get the financial compensation that can help him survive in a world he no longer recognizes.
It is a devastating reality. He's suffering from a dual failure of the system, the initial procedural failure that put him in prison, and now the legislative failure that is reluctant to properly compensate victims of judicial error.
The average person just assumes that if your conviction is quashed, you're immediately compensated for the mistake.
But that is simply not the legal reality in the UK under this specific legislative regime.
This entire case, from the coerced confession and the flawed bite mark analysis to the decades of delay at the CCRC, and now this compensation hurdle, has, not surprisingly, provoked a call for accountability.
Absolutely. The material confirms that the Labor MP Kim Johnson, who chairs the all-party parliamentary group on miscarriages of justice, immediately called for an independent inquiry into this case.
What would be the main focus of an inquiry like that?
Well, it would need to look forensically at the procedures used by Merseyside police back in the 1980s, specifically examining the systemic culture that allowed for the denial of legal counsel, the failure to provide an appropriate adult to a vulnerable suspect, and the alleged abuse that led to those retracted confessions.
So it's about determining if Peter Sullivan's experience was just an isolated incident, or if it was symptomatic of broader routine and unacceptable police practices at the time.
Exactly. And this kind of inquiry is vital not just for Peter Sullivan, but for the integrity of historical justice. We need to know if the methods used to secure this false conviction were standard operating procedure, and if the individuals responsible for that misconduct were ever held to account.
And beyond police procedure, I imagine the inquiry would also have to look at the reliance on so-called forensic science like bite marks.
It must. The widespread, decades-long acceptance of this subjective evidence led to countless convictions around the world. Understanding the institutional mechanisms that allowed that kind of pseudoscience to be presented as definitive fact in a court of law is essential to preventing future errors.
So, synthesizing all of this material, the story of Peter Sullivan and Diane Sindel is one of multiple cascading institutional failures.
It is. Police procedural failures in 1986, a reliance on flawed forensic analysis in 1987, decades of judicial inertia and CCRC resistance, and now a current legislative reluctance to fully compensate exonerees in 2025. It's a clear map of fragility within the system.
The consequence is this dual tragedy that continues to unfold. We have the brutal murder of Diane Sindel, whose family now has to face the reality that the perpetrator is still out there, confirmed by DNA evidence 38 years later.
And we have Peter Sullivan, whose life was literally stolen from him one day at a time for almost 4 decades. He has his freedom now, but the scars of that incarceration and the ongoing legal battle for financial redress, they remain.
The quest for justice is ongoing for both the victim of the crime and the victim of the state. It's a profound, sobering lesson about the dangers of unchecked institutional power operating under intense public pressure.
It is.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener? We've detailed the facts, the procedural abuses, the scientific breakthrough, and the heartbreaking timeline of delay. We've covered the failures that happened in 1987 and the legal hurdles that persist even today.
And this raises a really important structural question for you to think about, based on everything we've seen in this case. Given the decades-long lag between when DNA evidence was viable and when it was actually deployed here, what specific binding structural changes might be necessary?
What do you mean by that?
Well, for instance, should the Criminal Cases Review Commission be legally mandated, not just encouraged, to automatically trigger a retesting process for violent crime cases once forensic science reaches certain milestones? A system that ensures clear evidence of innocence is acted upon immediately, rather than waiting for years and years of administrative delay.
That is a critical question for policymakers and legal reformers to consider, especially when you think about the 38 years that Peter Sullivan can never, ever get back.
Indeed. The knowledge of his innocence existed in that evidence, yet the legal framework failed to utilize it for far too long.
Thank you for engaging with this very challenging exploration of the source material.
We really appreciate your attention to this significant story and to the details that reveal the true cost of delayed justice.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening.